Video games have come a long way since 1972, when Alan Alcorn created Pong, the first successful arcade game that forged the way for a whole new industry. Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto V had an overwhelming $1 billion in sales in its first 3 days on the market last year. If anybody still thinks video games are just for kids, there are a number of high-level industry executives laughing their way to the bank. With each passing year, technology progresses, and with it, so does the definition of what a video game can be. During gaming's early years, the whole concept was based on mechanics that translate to simple gameplay based on each game's defined set of rules. Memory and computational limits meant there was little room for adding game elements beyond what was necessary to inform gameplay mechanics. Today, the Sony PlayStation 4 is capable of 1.84 trillion floating point operations per second, allowing developers to focus on physics, artificial intelligence, and aesthetics. It is at this point that a developing question begins to appear. Are video games art? Did the medium cross the line from being something meant to simply entertain and pass time into something greater? A quick Google search for the definition of art tells us that art is the expression or application of human creative skill and imagination, typically in a visual form such as painting or sculpture, producing works to be appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power, as well as a very broad, works produced by human creative skill and imagination. Based on these definitions of art, video games would surely qualify, but there is still a lingering stigma as to whether or not the medium is ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with the great works of art painted by Van Gogh or the masterpieces of cinema directed by Kubrick. Video games have certainly grown up, but what turn must the medium experience to prove itself worthy of artistic analysis? Since there is no simple answer, the question must be examined from the scope of multiple disciplines. Writing, music, film, and even television are the contemporary art forms that most would be familiar with analysis of. Each artistic medium demonstrates its own nuances that require mastery in order to fully take advantage of what it has to offer. Volumes of books have been written analyzing these properties in the established forms of art, but video games are still relatively new, lacking the extensive technical details being put to pen and paper. We must first gain a base understanding of this in order to know when and if video games crossed into the territory of fine art. A developer undoubtedly favors the industry of his or her chosen field, but they are the artists behind video games if the medium is determined to in fact be an art form, making their insights on the matter significant. For reference, we must also consult analysis and criticism of alternative media. Before video games came into question, film was another recent and controversial addition to the art scene. Lastly, we will examine the ways in which gaming can evoke psychological change through emotional response. In recent years, 2 prominent documentaries have been released that take an inside look at video game development. Indie Game the Movie follows a small set of indie developers as they create, release, and reflect upon their development experience. Video Games the Movie is more overarching in its examination of video games over the years, interviewing developers, players, and celebrities about their experiences leading up to where video games stand today. In Indie Game the Movie, Edmund McMillan and Tommy Rafine's work on their game, Super Meat Boy, as they discuss their motivations and struggles regarding the field. It's why a writer writes. It's the most effective way they can express themselves. A video game is the best way I can express myself, Rafine asserts. McMillan expands on his partner's statement, saying, "My whole career has been me trying to find new ways to communicate with people because I desperately want to." Their game went on to be a major success, but indie developers are a relatively new breed. Valve Software's Steam digital distribution service changed the market when it bypassed retailers in delivering content directly to consumers. Platform makers Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo were quick to follow suit. The documentary also focuses on Braid, one of the earliest critically acclaimed indie games released on the Xbox Live Arcade. Creator Jonathan Blow describes his goal in game development as taking his own flaws and vulnerabilities and translating them into video games. In describing his response to the public perception of Braid, Blow states some of the most demoralizing things were actually positive reviews of the game. While many people enjoyed his game, they seem to be missing the point. There's a hope that people are going to understand the things that you did, and that you'll have some line of communication with your audience. Video Game the Movie's producer Will Wheaton describes video games as the same experience one would have by watching a movie or reading a book, except that games allow for active participation as opposed to passive observation. One of the industry's icons, Hideo Kojima, who is famous for his direction of the Metal Gear franchise, contributed, "In the 90s, with PlayStation and more powerful technology arriving, we had the gift of expression. Characters could talk, music could be created, characters could emote. Players want to relate to characters, so by becoming a character in a larger story, video games transformed into a medium that naturally made the player more invested." According to James Paul G's essay on games, he claims that humans find story elements profoundly meaningful and are at a loss when they cannot see the world in terms of such elements. Story elements help the player to associate meaning in video games, just as they do in other mediums. Because all the objects and movements in a game have been assigned meanings, and these meanings have helped generate the visual and auditory design of the game, the actions we players carry out produce more and more of that design. A player's interaction with the world produces a phenomenon that no other medium does, a second story. Each player has a unique experience that has them not only following the developer's story, but also crafting their own. Doug Walker, aka the Nostalgia Critic, has also pondered the question of video games as art. His immediate response is, yes they are, but he immediately digresses. Are video games high art, he asks, describing high art as timeless and to be remembered? As games have developed, they have looked to film for reference and tried to imitate the medium in many instances. Walker questions whether video games are simply a means of escapism before pointing out that film was also subject to the same criticism in its early years. Comics were another medium that was written off as childish entertainment until titles such as Alan Moore's Watchmen changed opinion. He qualifies choice to be where video games stand apart from their predecessors. In the end, Walker defends video games as art, stating, "If people don't see it now, they will." Walker references film critic Roger Ebert's infamous statement that video games could never be art. Game designer Kelly Santiago of that game company gave a TED Talk defending video games against Ebert's stance. She cites Jonathan Blow's Braid and that game company's Flower as projects that have crossed the line into art. While sensible in her efforts, Santiago does not provide solid evidence for her argument in the 15 minutes she stands on stage. In her closing words, she shifts her focus to evolution of radio and television. The mediums were revolutionary and empowering, but with time became culturally destructive. She makes the point that if we do not acknowledge the unique opportunities that video games present as an art form, they will suffer the same fate. Ebert responded to Santiago's argument in his online journal. He admitted it was foolish to say video games would never be art, but standing his ground, it is his opinion that no one living today will ever see video games exist as art. He goes down the list of points made by Santiago, scoffing at her Wikipedia definition and offering his own variation. He describes art as the imitation of nature in an effort to express ideas under the vision of a singular artist, while rules, goals, challenges, and interactions are the components of games, not art. 3 years later, the famous critic died at age 70, never reversing his opinion on the matter. It is worth note to consider that Ebert's age, as well as his film bias, could be a factor in his opinion. Over the course of his lifetime, technology developed at an alarming rate. We would not tend to associate technology with art. Yet this medium is dependent on technological advancement. Manipulating and understanding communication in games often requires hyper-attention and motor skills that are more effectively developed in one's youth, a luxury that Ebert was born too early for. With expression and emotion being key factors in defining art, understanding the psychological elements of video games becomes necessary. According to Jarvinen, psychological studies in cognition, emotion, and goal-oriented behavior have to be taken into account when trying to understand video game aesthetics. He sees separate game design elements as pieces of a greater whole that can bring meaningful gameplay experiences. By being a participant, we take on the goals within the game as our own. A game must convey information to the player in order to give them a point of reference or sense of urgency as they approach a goal. This game state, as Jarvinen refers to it, allows the player's involvement to exist and brings with it the ability to connect the game's many systems. There are two sets of rules that arise out of this. They are the design system of rules and the player-controlled system of rules. While designers cannot anticipate a player's actions, they can predict and direct players based on the game's rule set. Jarvinen promotes the study of game elements as they influence player psychology, revealing examples of effective mechanics in popular games. He breaks down emotion types into categories. Prospect-based, fortune of others, attribution, attraction, and well-being make up these categories and relate to variables that produce various responses. He names sense of reality, proximity, unexpectedness, and arousal as variables. He suggests that video games should be conceived and designed with these elements in mind to control intended emotional intensity. Different games present parallel goals, but player reaction and investment can be dramatically different, as he demonstrates with his comparison of Thrust and Eco. In Thrust, players must deliver a container through space as they avoid oncoming attackers. Bringing more emotional weight, Eco sees the players protecting a vulnerable young girl from strange foes in a maze-like castle. While the goals may be similar, the variables in place provoke very different emotions from the participant. In his conclusion, Jarvinen states, "These game design techniques provide examples of how feeling is embodied into aesthetic work, which from an emotional perspective is what creating art and entertainment is largely about." Between the perspectives presented here for game development, film analysis, and psychology, the consensus leans toward video games being accepted as art. This is not to say there are not conflicts that need to be addressed, though. Games may have matured to a great degree, but it is only in the last decade that the distribution process has been simplified. The digital age has opened a viable avenue for developers like Team Meat and Jonathan Blow to release their works to the masses for the first time. In that sense, it is still a new outlet for creation to many. Some of the most creative works today are coming from indie studios, while top-tier developers are criticized for their annualized franchise releases. Ken Levine became a household name for gamers when Irrational Games released System Shock 2. Considered one of the most influential games of its time, Levine took that acclaim and multiplied it with the release of BioShock 8 years later. Praised for its stunning art design and storytelling, BioShock's impact is still being felt 7 years later. As both writer and game director, Levine became the face of the franchise. Perhaps this addresses Ebert's expectation of art being the creation of an individual. Levine's own choices both contradict and support Ebert's statement, though. In 2013, Irrational Games released their final game, BioShock Infinite, before closing their doors for good. Levine took a small team of developers and started a new studio with the blessing of their publisher 2K Games. His exit from Irrational was reportedly to start work on a narrative-driven experience with high replayability, a feat that would break new ground for the medium. Returning to Ebert's insights, his definition of art said that the creation should attempt to imitate nature, and that is, in concept, what Levine is trying to do with his future project. The gaming community patiently waits to see the fruits of Levine's labors, and will likely be waiting for several years to come as he and his team go through research and development. Continuing to examine Levine's impact on the medium, we must examine narrative mechanics in the original BioShock. The world of Rapture, where the game takes place, is an underwater utopia destroyed by its own inhabitants. The environment reveals its mysterious history as the player progresses through the story. In a quest to find Rapture's creator, Andrew Ryan, and escape, the player is guided by a voice on his radio belonging to one of the inhabitants who calls himself Atlas. Throughout the course of the game, the player views the world from the eyes of their in-game character. Control of the character is maintained as Atlas asks the player, "Would you kindly perform various tasks on the journey to find Ryan?" Upon reaching Ryan, a revelation presents itself. "Would you kindly" was a mind-controlling phrase embedded in the player's character that would trigger an unquestioning obedience. Control is removed from the player as they watch the hands that have become an extension of their own beat Andrew Ryan to death with a golf club. It is a turning point that makes the player reflect on every choice they have made and turns attention to Atlas as the true antagonist. Not only did Levine craft an entertaining narrative with BioShock, but he also utilized methods of the emotional toolbox described by Jarvinen. The mechanics that extended to the player's eyes, ears, and hands all work together to draw an emotional response from the player. Indie developers like Team Meat did not have the financial resources of a publisher like Irrational did, and Super Meat Boy did not have the realistic graphics or dark, sprawling narrative of BioShock. Does that make one any less worthy than the other of being considered art? Super Meat Boy has a silly, lighthearted story and unique visual style. McMillan and Rafine's demonstrate their longing to express themselves through video game creations, a motivation shared by Blow, Kojima, Santiago, and Levine. By art's many definitions, it would seem that video games qualify as worthy of being a recognized medium today. So why does a pushback still exist? Gamers put a lot of hype into upcoming games. With some exceptions, it is not because of the artists and programmers designing the game or the director overseeing the project. It's because publishers spend millions advertising their next product as a must-play experience. When the latest entry in the Call of Duty franchise was revealed, gamers were not given a trailer of actual gameplay, but instead, Kevin Spacey speaking over a montage of action scenes, bookended by a voice telling them to pre-order the game to receive additional content with their purchase. A business tactic used to guarantee sales and ensure investors that the game will perform well. But it is the gamer that is being deceived into buying a product that has yet to prove itself to ensure they do not miss out on the full experience. Compare it to movie studios asking you to buy a ticket to an upcoming release months in advance to make sure that you get to see an exclusive additional scene in their film. Audiences would be outraged, and gamers are beginning to share that feeling. And there's another problem to consider. Walker asked, "Are video games timeless?" We still talk about games like Super Mario Bros. 3 decades after its release, but the business today is creating hurdles for itself. By constantly releasing sequels to popular franchises, the industry must rapidly convince audiences that the last game purchase they made is already outdated, leaving little chance to reflect on one game before they are being sold another, thus creating art that will ultimately go underappreciated. Why are gamers so intensely concerned anyway that games be defined as art? Ebert asks in his closing remarks. Do they want to be able to look up from the screen and explain, "I'm studying a great form of art"? People ultimately care about what they care about, whether it be film or video games. Ebert analyzed cinema for a living, and therefore he was deeply invested in it. In a time when games like Flappy Bird garner more attention than those trying to push the medium, it is easy for gamers to become defensive. Industry journalists try to spur mature conversations regarding video games, but there's a vocal group of gamers that counter their efforts by trolling forums and multiplayer lobbies with rampant fanboyism. In the end, the people who play video games are largely responsible for the perception of games by the way they choose to present themselves. Video games will continue to evolve with technology, so the audience must as well if the medium is to be taken seriously. Doug Walker concluded that video games would eventually be considered art, regardless of the current consensus. Through the integrative study presented here, the evidence supports his claim. Even Roger Ebert's characterization of fine art is fulfilled by exploring the roles that video game developers like Ken Levine have played in the industry. Games are capable of emotional storytelling and character development through their own unique elements that differentiate the medium. Artists express themselves in games, and in turn, players express themselves through the element of choice. While understanding effective emotional elements in video games is still in its infancy, further exploration is proving year after year that developers are becoming more capable of seizing the tools described by Jarvinen. And with indie development, creative minds are making their mark as they demonstrate alternative design elements within the limits of their resources. Gamers have shown their support for smaller projects like Super Meat Boy and Braid, elevating their humble creators' names to levels rivaling the industry's most highly regarded veterans. Not every game strives to present itself as a piece of art. A video game that simply provides an entertaining experience serves its purpose if it finds an audience. It may not incite the same philosophical discussion that BioShock has, but everything is relative to its subject. As video games spread to more screens, new methods of play are introduced, exposing a wider audience to the medium. Technological advancements have brought video games farther than the medium's pioneers ever anticipated, creating a whole new form of expression. Whether seen from the perspective of the creator or the player, there is an experience to be appreciated that connects them. A culture has risen out of gaming, uniting players around the world through their passion and love for the medium. So whether the world considers video games worthy seems negligible. All forms of art have their own appeal to the audience they serve. That does not objectively make those pieces any less a work of art to those outside that appeal. By that logic, video games have earned an artful place among the mediums that came before them.